Welcome to the Alaskaland podcast, stories from the Fairbanks North Star Borough's past, present, and future, with your host, Mayor Bryce Ward. Each episode, we'll sit down with Fairbanks' most interesting characters for a fascinating conversation about where we've been and where we're going. And now, Mayor Ward.
Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome, folks. This is the Alaskaland podcast. I'm Mayor Bryce Ward, and today we have Brian with the Tanana Valley Railroad Association. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Maybe, Brian, tell us a little bit. We're going to talk past, present, future. Tell us a little bit about the history of the organization and the railroad and kind of what you're here to do.
Absolutely. So our organization began in 1990. It was a group of locals around the community who saw engine number one, a locomotive sitting here at Pioneer Park, just out in the open weather. And they were train fans since a young age, and they got together, kind of found some support to put a small shelter around it. But the idea continued to dwell in their mind that, hey, what would it be to actually have this locomotive running? And so they got this 1899 Porter locomotive, moved from its location to back more so by the river, kind of close to where the terminal was at the time. And they had a shed in which they brought the locomotive in, and for 9 years they worked on restoring the locomotive, and finally for its centennial in 1999 the locomotive engine number one ran for the first time in over 40 years for here at Pioneer Park. And another season into the 2000s it took to actually get things in order. But starting in 2000, 2001, passenger trains were actually offered on that steam locomotive. And engine number one has some history to it, too. It was the first locomotive in the Yukon Territory of Canada for the Coal Creek mining operation there in the northern part of the territory. And then in 1903, one of the benefactors for the Coal Creek operation was actually one of the instigators in forming the Tanana Mines Railroad here in the interior. And they when the Coal Creek mine operation was going down, they bought some of the equipment, engine number one included. And in 1904, it arrived, becoming the first locomotive here in the interior and northern parts of Alaska. And so that's where the name number one comes from. It wasn't the first locomotive built by Porter or anything like that, but it is the first locomotive in those two regions. And so, intriguingly, actually, when it came on the Tanana Mines Railroad, many people hadn't ridden a train before. Even coming to the territory of Alaska, they came by steamships. And so for some in documented history, it was their first train ride. And so for number one, it has a lot of standing points here in the community.
A lot of meaning to the Fairbanks region. So this railroad, what did it do here in Fairbanks when it was first started?
When Fairbanks was established, of course, it was a trading post to begin with. But then the finding of gold brought prospectors from near and far. Mm-hmm. And they kept finding gold more and more in more spots farther away from the trading post and town site. And so that's where the idea of we need to establish something to get equipment, supplies, and goods out to these gold fields. And of the time in the early 20th century, a railroad was kind of the key thing to think about. The river system was an idea, but the river system didn't connect in the way that was needed going out to the Chattanooga Valley. Mm-hmm. And the Gold Stream Valley as well. There's streams. There's no actual rivers to traverse. And so a railroad was first established between the town site of Chena and the town site of Fairbanks. Now, Chena and Fairbanks were rival towns. One was always trying to compete with the other, but the railroad unified that eventually. The Tanana Mines Railroad, which later became the Tanana Valley Railroad, first started milepost 00 at the town site of Chena because that was the easiest spot to have railroad rails, ties, all that sort of stuff start at. And then they went the couple of miles along the Chena River. At the time, it was the Chena Slough. They went the couple of miles to where Fairbanks was their town site. And then season after season, they added to it more and more so. And they went through and had a spur that went up to what would become the Alaska, the school, the University Hill. And then they continued year after year. They built, eventually reaching Chattanooga. And they had multiple stops around along the rail line to service the multiple gold fields and gold operations there. And the Tanana Valley Railroad even went down to Nenana. In 1917, the Alaska Railroad met at the Nenana River, but they couldn't cross the river. And so the Tanana Valley Railroad built a line all the way down to the north side of the river in Nenana. And in the summer times, they would barge across any freight or any people so that they can meet the Tanana Valley Road. And in the wintertime, they would put tracks. They would lay tracks on the ice. And that actually is the start of the Nenana Ice Classic. The railroad workers would wager when the tracks would go out. But then in 1923, when the Mears Bridge was built, the tracks were no longer needed on the ice, so that's when the tripod came into play. So the Tanana Valley Railroad, though it is a small community operation for us, it did have impacts throughout our local area, as well as what would eventually become the Alaska Railroad's main line here to Fairbanks in 1923. So the Tanana Valley Railroad definitely had some parts playing history, not just here in Fairbanks.
That's amazing. And it's hard to believe that there was these two kind of rival communities. Fairbanks obviously won out over the town of Chena, but Chena is kind of about the Chena Small Tracks area right now, right? Is that
Chena Small Tracks area. Most of the area around what's that road name? I need to.
So there's, you got the pump house.
Chena Pump Road. That's what
Chena
it is.
Pump,
yeah.
Okay.
The closer and closer you get to the actual where the Chena dumps into the Tanana, that was part of the old town site of Chena. And the Tanana Mines Railroad went from that location to downtown, where downtown Fairbanks is today. And eventually, though, with the Alaska Railroad coming to Fairbanks in 1923, that was the downfall of the Tanana Mines Railroad, and eventually ending in August of 1930. They filed bankruptcy.
Oh, wow.
So engine number one was one of the few remaining pieces of equipment that was actually saved. And the Alaska Engineering Commission, which later became the Alaska Railroad, decided this locomotive does play some importance, and it's a cute little thing too. So they put it on a pedestal in downtown Fairbanks in front of their depot. And then in 1967, for the A67 exposition, what would become Alaskaland would become Pioneer Park. They moved that locomotive here to Pioneer Park for historic display as well. And then, of course, in 1990, our group got founded to shelter it, eventually restore it. And now, on special occasions like Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day in the summers, except for 2021, we pull that locomotive out. And our organization, we are all volunteers. Our organization operates that steam locomotive for passenger service on those special days.
Yeah, that's great. I've actually ridden with my kids on the train a few times. The old engine number one.
Yeah,
and they absolutely love it. They call this is the train park for them.
Yes.
I was just sharing with Donnie. So it's a very special thing. Let's talk a little bit about what you guys are doing now. So you mentioned that the organization came into being in the 90s, early 90s.
Correct.
And a lot has changed since then. Yes. I can remember when I was a kid, there was nothing over where the depot is now. The old depot is still there, but there's a new depot.
Correct.
I say new for me. It's not.
It's new for me too. Yeah.
It's what, 10 years old now?
So it was built in 2006.
Oh, older than that. Okay.
16. So 15 years now.
Gotcha.
We've had that building, and that building came into play based on a joint effort from Parks and Recreation, the borough, the Department of Transportation, and our organization. And so we fundraised, we got grants, and applied for federal funding, or state and federal funding, and that building is now the home and museum for the railroad as what we know it today. It's home to one of the last 3 remaining items of the rolling stock of the Tanana Mines and Tanana Valley Railroad. There's 2 locomotives left and 1 boxcar that are known to exist, and we have one of them. And then the Huckleberry Railroad down in the States, they have the 2nd locomotive, and then our organization has that 1 boxcar as well.
And as I understand, you're doing a restoration on the boxcar as well, right?
We are attempting. The boxcar was in some bad weather situations, and so we're trying as much as we can to preserve that to preserve that boxcar. It's an ongoing project, and we'll see how it ends sooner rather than later.
So if someone was interested in being a part of your organization or helping with restoration, or just they're interested in trains and in learning more about Fairbanks history, how would they go about doing that?
So we have our website, tananavalleyrailroad.org, and simply put, all that's needed is to fill out a membership application. Membership for the first year is free, and then thereafter the membership starts at $25. But that membership gets you a lot of things. If you want to be part of the museum efforts, you can do that. If you want to be part of the operations, we call it operations. And so that's the annual working on the locomotive. That's the operations of the locomotive. Membership will get you that. And then we also have partnerships with other railroad museums and railroad entities around the state. And every year we try and do something called Train Weekend. And so we start here in Fairbanks and we go down to Nenana to see that depot. We go down to Denali to have some lunch there, make our way into Wasilla for the 557 restoration, the Alaska Transportation Museum, all the way to Anchorage and sometimes Seward to see the Alaska Railroad and other railroad entities there too.
So there are small rails that have basically built Alaska, and that's part of what your organization does, is work with those other groups that capture that.
Our organization started just as the Tanana Valley Railroad, but Fairbanks has such a potluck style, a melting pot of community efforts, that our organization blossomed in the early 2000s to not just incorporate Tanana Valley Railroad, but also to promote the history of railroading throughout Alaska and the Yukon. And so while our engine house here at Pioneer Park does specifically relate to the Tanana Valley Railroad, our organization in general volunteers and helps in the efforts of other railroad entities around the state as well.
And from what I understand too, is your organization has a part in the park here with the SS Nenana and the Harding car. Maybe talk a little bit about what you do with those.
Of course, there are neighbors. The SS Nenana was actually a boat that was commissioned by the Alaska Engineering Commission, the Alaska Railroad. Of course, it's the 2nd largest wooden hull sternwheeler vessel existing in the world today. But many people don't realize that the Alaska Railroad commissioned the building and the operation of these ships because when they got to Nenana prior to 1923, they couldn't cross the river. And of course, there was money to be made through the trading and the selling of goods and services up and down the river system. And that's where the Alaska Railroad got the idea, hey, let's actually play a part in these in this operation. And so they commissioned these boats like the SS Nenana, and of course the ship is still with us today. And that's one fun thing. It's like the tripod that a lot of people don't realize. That's the Alaska Railroad had a part to play in that.
That's amazing. I didn't know that until just now as well.
Yeah.
So,
and then of course the Harding car. It's the official name of it is the Denali car. And when President Warren G. Harding came to Alaska in the summer of 1923, his intended purpose coming up here was to ceremoniously complete the Alaska Railroad by driving a golden spike on the north end of the Mears Bridge at the town site of Nenana. And to do that, he came up on a ship to southeast Alaska, did a little bit of meandering through there, and then landed and docked in Seward, where he boarded a passenger train with his entourage, if you will. His family and his entourage came up, and the Denali car was one of the cars of his train, and it's actually recorded that that's the one car he spent most of his time. And that is the car at the end of the train where he was able to give one of his speeches, because it is an observation car. If you go in it today, you actually walk on the platform where he stood giving speeches around the rail belt communities, including here in Fairbanks.
That's amazing. And it's here in the park.
Correct. Yes. And on most days, you can walk through and you can see the bedrooms that part of the family and himself slept in, and you can just see the wonderful building that those types of cars were done in the early part of the 20th century.
So looking to the future, things like the Harding car, the Tanana, and engine number 1, and now the boxcar, one of the last remaining parts of that railroad. There's ongoing efforts to preserve these features and these items from our past. And so maybe talk a little bit about what your hopes are for the future, for the organization, for the rail, for the park.
Yes.
And what folks can do to be a part of that.
Well, looking to the future, starting with the park, this season, Parks and Recreation has done the wonderful job of getting the ball rolling in terms of working on the trestle bridges here at the park and working on the rail bed as well. And that work, granted, yes, people come in and wanting to ride the train, but that work allows us to have the train operations for hopefully decades to come. We look at it as a blessing in disguise, because that work, of course, needs to be done, and it is being done this year. Our organization, in reference to the Harding car and the SS Nenana, of course, the Friends of the SS Nenana, that is their main project, is the preservation and the promotion of the SS Nenana sternwheeler. The Harding car, though we have the history of it, our organization doesn't do too much with it here at the park. Of course, that's Parks and Recreation and Pioneer Park, and the staff, they do wonderful. Every single year for the holidays, they put lights up on it, and then in the summertime, they have it open so people can go walk through, and there's paneling in there to showcase some of the history as well. But for our organization, looking forward, you bring up volunteers. We are a completely volunteer organization, and we wouldn't be where we are today without those dedicated members. Even if you want to volunteer for 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 weeks, we would most graciously accept you, and we need you also, because our work can't be done if no one's there to do it. And so that's one thing we're working on, is regrowing our membership, trying to see what projects people would be interested, and how we can provide the resources for it to get done. Of course, general fundraising, we have grandiose ideas of different fundraising topics. Like we were recently just talking about a live music dinner fundraiser. And so that hopefully will be under wraps for this coming fall. And then looking for the future, we're constantly thinking of ideas of how to keep the museum proactive. Having the same thing season after season for 30 years doesn't do justice. And innovation, it's basic economics. You need to constantly innovate for people to be interested. And so that's part of our partnership with our friends down in the lower parts of Alaska, as well as in the States. Anytime we have our volunteers going to different places, we say, go to this railroad operation, take some pictures, and talk with them, and bring back some ideas. And, it's a slow process, but we constantly have new displays going through our museum. And that's what we're looking at, is we're just finding new ways to reach out to our community and to others as well, and to promote the history of the Tanana Valley Railroad as long as best we can.
That's great. Well, Brian, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today, and encourage folks to come down to the park, visit the museum, learn a little bit more about this. And if you're just interested, if this has piqued your interest and it's something you want to be a part of, come down and become a member.
Absolutely.
The Friends of the Tanana Valley Railroad, and help carry this history into the future for Fairbanks. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Take care.
Fairbanks, oh Fairbanks.
Thanks for listening to the Alaskaland podcast. We hope you found today's conversation enlightening. For more episodes, listen on your mobile device through your favorite podcast app, or watch at youtube.com/Fairbanks North Star Borough.